Wir fangen an und ich freue mich, den ersten Beitrag ankündigen zu können und würde dafür schon einmal Benjamin Seibel noch einmal und Gabriella Gómez-Mont zu mir auf die Bühne bitten und viel Spaß wünschen. Mehr bleibt mir nicht übrig.
Hallo, da bin ich wieder. Ich werde jetzt gleich auf Englisch wechseln, weil dieser Talk auf Englisch sein wird. Es wird aber parallel auch in der Pixelwelt eine deutschsprachige Session geben, für die, die keine Lust haben, einem englischsprachigen Vortrag zu lauschen. So, I'm switching to English for our first keynote speaker, who's a very special keynote speaker at that. And this is a very special occasion for me. And maybe let me tell you why. The story of the origins of CityLAB Berlin would be a talk in itself, so I'm reducing it to a small anecdote. In the summer of 2015, I just started my work at Technologiestiftung Berlin. I was still quite new at the field, and I was talking to some other people from the civic innovation communities, people from Open Knowledge Foundation and others that we had in Berlin. And we were discussing this idea of having an urban innovation lab here in the city. And I knew some other international projects, like I heard of New Urban Mechanics in Boston, where I lived before I moved to Berlin. I knew MindLab in Denmark and Wach in Amsterdam, who all did great work. And then someone, I think it was Julia Kloiber, I don't know if she's here today, mentioned, well, recently they opened an innovation lab in Mexico City, and you should check that out. So I went to this homepage of Laboratorio Para, Ciudad, excuse my Spanish, and I was immediately struck, I was like, wow, this is it. This looked so creative and colorful and bold, and it was citizen-centric, it was also governmental. And I was really, really impressed by it. And later that year, when we wrote the first concept for CityLAB Berlin for the Senate Chancellery, I remember, we never made it to Mexico City. Yeah, we were poor. But I remember having the browser tab of your website open at all times during the concepts. And I think, well, if great projects stand on the shoulders of giants, then I'm really happy to have a real trailblazer in the field of civic innovation here with us today. I'd like to welcome Gabriella Gómez-Mont, the founder of Mexico City's Urban Innovation Lab. I'm not saying that again. Sorry, you can say the name again in Spanish. But I'm very proud and honored to have you here. Gabriella founded this lab. She also held a position that is one of the most fascinating governmental positions that I've ever heard from. She was a chief creative officer of Mexico City during that time when she founded the lab. Gabriella is also a visual artist, director of documentary films. She's a regular lecturer at some of the most prestigious universities in the world. She's a consultant for cities. We're glad that we had her also on our expert panel on the smart city strategy, where she gave some valuable inputs for our own new smart city strategy. And now she's the founder of Experimentalista, a creative studio that brings urban and political planners together with artists and philosophers. We are very curious to hear some of your experiences. To the audience, you can ask your questions in the chat. There will be a moderated Q&A afterwards. But now we are looking forward to your keynote. Gabriella, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. I am absolutely thrilled to be speaking to one of my other very favorite cities in the world. So even though Mexico City and Berlin are quite different in many ways, I think that we have a similar spirit. So I'm going to be sharing my screen and start with a presentation. Let's see if that works. Okay. And present. Okay, so that should be working. So today, as you well know, I titled the talk Realist of a Larger Reality, and it will be about cities, political imagination, and social creativity. As Ben was mentioning, from 2013 to 2018, I was the Chief Creative Officer for Mexico City, that, as you probably know, is one of the largest cities in the world. And also, as Ben mentioned, nowadays I am directing Experimentalista. And before the pandemic, and even with the pandemic, I have now been working with different cities on 5 continents, sometimes government directly, sometimes foundations, sometimes universities, sometimes museums. So hopefully expanding the conversations that we started in the lab in different ways, in different urban social typologies. And one of the things that I'm actually researching deeply right now with Hebels Foundation here in Amsterdam, where I now live, is this issue of urban futures in a digital world. So in many ways, the urbanization of the world, as well as the digitalization of the world, is possibly one of the 2 biggest influences of how our societies and cities will evolve. And very briefly, because this is a very long conversation that someday hopefully we can get into with Berlin, is that one of the things that we have found interviewing people from 5 continents as well, is that there is very much an issue with the sequestered imagination on a worldwide basis. And this I mean in terms of urbanity in cities. Obviously, we have been optimizing cities mostly for productivity and efficiency. And I think that there's a really interesting question that we must make, perhaps not even interesting, but urgent, is what are cities for and who are they for? And then in terms of the digital agenda, smart cities have obviously taken over a lot of the conversations of the urban digital. But in a way, I actually find that it's quite problematic because it has an incredibly corporate origin. So I think that even though the digital transformation of governments, of societies, et cetera, is, again, incredibly important, incredibly useful, can articulate and amplify voices in ways like never before. In a certain sense, what happens, like, doing a Google search, if you put in smart cities or cities of the future, these are the first images that appeared. I didn't even choose them. So it seems that the future is blue. It seems that it's peopleless, and it seems that it is kind of like this technology first thing that I think that we should start questioning. So since today I know is Digital Day, and I know that for all of us labs, including CityLAB Berlin, technology is an important thing, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, or what we did at the lab, and the type of work that I'm doing right now. Again, recognizing the importance of the digital and the technological, but as well trying to open this up to a much more transdisciplinary conversation, and one that enters cities in a very different way. So the title of this talk actually comes from a quote that I love by Ursula K. Le Guin that says, "Hard times are coming, when we'll be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality." And I love this quote. And even though Le Guin, as a science fiction writer, was speaking mostly about literature and arts, I actually, first of all, think that this applies to everybody, like, all of these transdisciplinary groups that should be working on cities. But I also think it makes a case of why it is incredibly important to bring the creative fields back very deep into the urban conversation, and not only have this be through the eyes and the voices of technologists and urbanists, but really try to think about all of this incredibly rich social scape that we have that could be speaking about cities. So I will tell you a little bit about Laboratorio Para la Ciudad and some of these projects. As you well know, because you have one yourself, laboratories around the world within government have popped up and down. Like the lab, actually, with the change of government, no longer exists, though several of my team members are still working on the agendas that we started, and as well as many of the people that we worked with in terms of Mexico City. And even though we're incredibly different depending on the cities that we're birthed in, where in the government structure we are, I actually reported directly to the mayor of Mexico City. We all have 2 very important things in common. Like, one of them is in this world where there's such disbelief in government in many places, Mexico City most definitely at the time. How is it that at the same time that we think that citizens can many times be apathetic, we are seeing, and there seems to be a crisis of democracy? Why is it that there seems to be so many citizen-led projects everywhere you can find, like people working in gardens, helping their neighbors, doing cultural projects, artistic interventions? So in the first sense, one of the first things that we wanted to explore at the lab is how do we create a much better bridge between all of these people that really want to sink their hands into the city, and how can actually government support that instead of these being 2 divided conversations? And the second bit, just as important, is that we all want, obviously, our governments to be solid and sure-footed as they go forward. But at the same time, we also know that many times governments are 10, 20, maybe 40 years behind many conversations that are happening elsewhere. So how can we actually create safe spaces of experimentation where there is a language, where there are methodologies, where there are the types of teams that learn how to learn continuously, where government can take risks, but in a safe way, and then figure out, if successful, what does that actually entail for the rest. One of the things that made us quite different to all of the other labs, I think, is my delirious beast of a city, which is Mexico City. It is 9.5 million people city proper, 21 million people on the metropolitan area. Everything you speak about Mexico City is in the superlatives. Like, there are around almost 4 million kids in the metropolitan area under age 14. So, that is a whole city, sometimes a whole country just of kids in terms of comparison of other places. And it is also a city of extremes, incredibly diverse, which I love, but it also has an Achilles heel, which that diversity can many times turn into divisiveness. So we have, the former number one billionaire of the world, now paltry number 7, but also one of the lowest minimum wages of all the world. As you can see, we have our boulevards that are modeled after Champs-Élysées and this Haussmannian ideal of the modernist global city. But then also Mexico City is 60% self-constructed. So this is actually a co-produced megalopolis in the very, very most extreme notion of the word. This is Plaza de la Revolución, and on one day you can see it filled with children and playing with the fountains, and then the next day you can actually see a whole protest of teachers in underwear. That for some reason we love getting naked in public space in Mexico City. So as you can see, like, this is an incredibly dynamic city that does not sit still. I had a very young team, average age around 28. We were 20 people. And perhaps also one of the other differences to many labs at the time was that we were incredibly transdisciplinary. So I had half of my team came from urban and political sciences. The other half came from the humanities. So I had urban geographers, political scientists, AI experts, internationalists, lawyers, administrators working hand in hand with artists, designers, filmmakers, philosophers, historians, writers, et cetera, and everything that we did sat in between, specifically because we thought that our ideas of a city and to be able to really think about the big questions and not only the solutions to the big questions was incredibly important. And I think that there is no better place than in the marriage of disciplines and between, a very practical sense of the city, but also an idealistic way of entering the city. And of course, being Mexico City, I even had a mass wrestler on my team. And I love speaking about Jorge because even though he's like a political scientist, he is also one of the most beloved activists in mobility. And before The Guardian ousted him and, unmasked the Mexico City superhero, he kept his identity secret. So on one hand, he was an activist and fighting for the rights of pedestrians. And on the other hand, he was working at the lab as a government official by day. But I actually love this because this is very much what the lab tried to do. Because why is it that government has become only about bureaucracy in the eyes of citizens? Why is it that we find that the political space is too fraught with difficulties and not interesting enough? So I really think that there is a way of entering the political sense of a city that is about fascination when we actually want to engage citizens. And so this ethos of seriousness and being very technical at turns, but also incredibly playful and hopefully inventive in the way that we approach the problems was very important for my team, especially because this was the big question that kept us up at night. Can we imagine a city from a different place? It was not necessarily an easy feat in Mexico City. These are the numbers of untrust in local government. The last Pew survey of 2018 actually said that only 8% of Mexicans actually believe that democracy is working. So we were at the very, very bottom of the list. So it's not necessarily an easy territory. It was incredibly fraught, this in-betweenness of disciplines, this in-betweenness of government and civil society, but it was also incredibly fascinating, I must say. So the things that we tried to think about and bring together and synthesize were the urban, the political, the social, the creative, and try to speak about those tensions and translations and new urban languages and political forms that were available to us through this new toolkit that was government. The reason why many activists actually stepped onto my team is because they thought that their agendas could actually not go that much further only from the civic space, but actually needed to change laws to think about how we really make different the way that the government was approaching things. So as a good lab, we functioned with experiments, and we did hundreds and hundreds of experiments. Everything from starting conversations, our rooftop was continuously filled with people having urban discussions, and it was a delight to see that everything would fill up. But we were also doing quite a bit of skill building within government, because of course, if you want to transform cities, and governments are such an incredibly influential vehicle into city urban life, you also need to speak about these things within government and create new skill sets, and many times actually new roles as well. So we did everything from deep research and editorial projects, but we also created the first proper open data platform for Mexico City, the first APIs that were incredibly successful. So, things that are still obviously up and running, such as the air quality of Mexico City, that it was the first time that was available towards the outside, and now a lot of people plug into. But with everything what we did, including these foundational things such as open everything, like open knowledge, open platforms, open everything, what was beyond the foundational things that we did, what we really wanted to do was prototype a collaborative society. What does that actually look like? So as we would take every and any excuse. So for example, when they invited us to help curate and make a call for proposals for the architecture of a fair that occurs, the Fair of the Friendly Culture that occurs every year in Mexico City, we decided, first of all, how do we turn this into a showcase of young architects so that they can, be incredibly inventive in the way that they are thinking things while they're actually building a portfolio, and it can become a sort of showcase because there's even 2 million people passing on any given day in the Zócalo of Mexico City, which is our main square. So it was amazing, and it would get a lot of press and touch. So we would work with them. And let's say the pavilions that ended up here, we had just had an earthquake. And so besides being able to give this exhibition space to young architects, another thing that we would do was actually, we asked all the submitted proposals that the things that they built had to have an afterlife. So many of these kiosks that you see here actually then had an afterlife in many of the towns across Mexico that had been incredibly hard hit by the earthquake. So that was one of the ways of engaging communities and thinking about generosities and circular economies and whatnot. At the same time, we also had a pavilion there that showcased things from Mexico City. Because, government loves speaking about itself. But we decided that as government, one of the other things that we could do is actually talk about the amazing projects that are happening in Mexico City, but that many times we don't realize just because it's such a sprawling, humongous city. So we did a mapping of all of these super interesting citizen-led initiatives and gave them a space there. Amongst one of those projects that we had already been working with was Isla Urbana, that at the time was a very small, incredibly interesting studio dedicated to water in Mexico City, where there's a huge issue. Like, even though we have as much rainfall as London on any given year, Mexico City is also we also run out of water quite frequently, and on any given day there's about 1 million people that do not have access to running water. So Isla Urbana had been working with small communities across Mexico City, installing rain captation systems. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but I'm sure you know what you mean. And so, of course, they were working at an interesting scale, but we decided, okay, this is a citizen-led thing that has a potential to scale. So together with them, we created a whole event, putting together scientists as well as people in the Senate of Mexico City, and to speak about exactly this, issues of water, issues of collaboration between science, design, lawmakers, government, et cetera, and truly trying to think of what would the politics of the people mean? How do we scale these projects? And so I'm very happy to say that the new mayor of Mexico City, 2 years ago, when we had just left the program, because of a lot of the momentum that we had created and the good press that was happening because of the great work of Isla Urbana, the new mayor of Mexico City then prototyped 100,000 of these systems in the marginalized communities of Mexico City, and it will probably keep on scaling. So this is how a very small thing in a collaboration with government actually can create a completely different scale. So incredibly interested in creative governance. We found amazing projects across the city, such as Chavos Banda. These were former people that used to be former young gang members in Mexico City that it started getting incredibly bloody, as you can imagine. And so they actually created an amazing space that gives new skills to people that were formerly in gangs, and they were former gang members themselves, to get them into street art, into the music industry, et cetera, et cetera. There's also projects such as this senior citizen home that, with the participatory budget of Mexico City, in one of our most marginalized communities, they mixed half daycare center, half senior citizen home. And, Finland, it was all over the news about 5 years ago when they did something similar, because obviously, it's intergenerational, it's incredible for the communities. But this happened actually in a marginalized community of Mexico City about a decade ago. So there's a lot of innovation that can come out of these places. And this is then when things like technology can come in, because we created a platform for all of the participatory budgeting in Mexico City, and projects such as the two that I had mentioned, where people could finally figure out what was happening in their communities, could become inspired, could get in touch with the organizers, and could basically see all of these hidden things in Mexico City. But beyond doing specific projects, we really thought it was important for us to create what we call the vision for a megalopolis, of really thinking about the type of city that we want. So just to give you an example, all of my teams was divided in what we called cities. So open city, playful city, pedestrian city, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is, let's say, Pedestrian City would gather communities around questions. Some of them were huge questions, like how do we make a pedestrian city in a megalopolis? Besides that seems to be the opposite of what we do, but it's actually only 30% of people in Mexico City actually own a car. So we are a pedestrian city, but we don't necessarily recognize ourselves as such. So every project, every urban agenda would have a whole community around these questions, always open-ended, always evolving, always shifting, not necessarily easy ones in a megalopolis. And then what an agenda would look like this is the agenda of a year. It would be comprised of everything that was needed. We would first do a policy sweep, what's out there, an ecosystem sweep, who's out there, like who's already working on things, what are the gaps, what are the obstacles, what is the potential? And then many times we'd work on best practices, such as a data portal that wasn't necessarily our purview, but since there was none, we decided to make one, basically. And so best practices, but then also sometimes change laws, like we did the open city law that was open everything. I won't get into it, but it was actually a quite interesting law. And then we create our portfolio of experiments, like where are the things that we need to experiment with? And a true experiment is when you don't know the outcome, you don't know the answer yet. And so you do things in the urban space to start figuring out what those answers are. And so we would be doing all of this at once. It was slightly overwhelming, but your community is your superpower, so we weren't doing it alone, even though on my team, about 2 people were part of each of these cities. So we would host everything for, let's say, the data festival when the portal came out, and have like 1,200 people signing up for one of the data festivals. We would also form small communities, let's say, if this is Code for America, that actually helped the ministries open up their data, and we're also creating technological projects. All of these came from civil society, and they worked with city government for 8 months. And so one of the things that we saw and why we got into the data conversation was, cities definitely need data-driven policy. We also knew that we were lacking skill sets within government. So basically we started creating collaborations with universities in Mexico City. This is UNAM, one of Mexico City's main universities that has about 350,000 students. So it's the second largest university after Calcutta. But we had not been using this insane university power for the benefit of the city. So how do you actually create an urban agenda that starts involving all of the actors that you have in the city? So we worked on, let's say, in terms of the Open Cities team, worked on bringing in academia, civil society, government, and defining specific public problems or public challenges to be solved. We signed with more than 8 universities for data-driven policy. So when we didn't have profiles, we actually started using the muscle of civil society for these things. And we knew that beyond the data and the data-driven policy, cities also need experimentation. So with these types of teams, we would work on things that sometimes were layered upon already existing government programs. So this is a program in Mexico City called Médico en tu casa, Doctor at Your House. And so I love that beyond discussing if, people should have a right to medical insurance or not, there was actually a legion of doctors that for the people from marginalized communities, the elderly, the people with terminal illnesses that could for some reason not get themselves to a hospital or to a doctor, the government for free would send a doctor to your house. But the thing is, at the time, we weren't necessarily doing anything with the data. So we worked with an ecosystem and a young, really interesting technology company that actually created a platform with all of those medical standards and obviously safety concerns so that this data could actually start giving out important information. And then we worked with UNAM again and the Center of Complex Sciences that were doing some incredibly interesting studies around obesity and diabetes, which is rampant, unfortunately, in Mexico City. Another one of the call for proposals that we did was in terms of air quality, just to show you how this evolved. And but basically, we have very expensive towers, and there are 8 of them, so we're great at averages. But we couldn't necessarily do readings on the ground, and so we worked with another set of this was another collaboration where we actually calibrated like very cheap sensors created by a young Mexican company with these, and they also created AI algorithms that were able to bring out some measurements, some a little bit more complicated through inference, basically using this calibration against others. And so, that's one type of experimentation, and that's technological. But sometimes we would be working on an agenda such as the mobility agenda. And obviously, you need to know how your city moves. And then when we were doing the public mobility agenda, we suddenly found that we had no idea what was happening with our informal bus system on the ground. So these little green buses that you see, they're called the Microbuses. This is the largest informal bus system in the whole world. It moves an astounding 14 million individual rides a day, and 70% of the people that use public transportation in Mexico City actually use this. But there's a huge issue since Mexico City sprawled 35 times in size from the 60s to the 90s. The government knew where the buses left and where they ended, but had no idea what happens in between. That for all of you policy and urban experts, there's 2 very important problems there. One of them is there is no way of understanding as a bus user how to get from one place to another. So, you basically needed to ask 5 people, average out, who do you trust more? And so it's no surprise that we actually have the most painful commute in the world, according to TomTom and IBM surveys. And on the other end, how do you actually create transportation policy when you don't know how 70% of your people are moving on the ground? So we always had baby budgets, but this was exactly the type of problem that we were always very interested in engaging with. So we put together a working team comprised of people of government, of people of civil society, technology activists, whatnot. And we decided to crack this. It was a long process of defining how, but we decided to create a citywide game. If Mexico City has something, it's people. And created a mapaton where you would get points from mapping all of the route. And it was kind of like a competition. And basically, it was not necessarily for the faint-hearted, because one of the things that we found out while we were doing the prototypes was that there were some buses that took 9.5 hours to get from one place to the other and back. So, it was quite a challenge, and we really needed a lot of people to join our forces. So to our huge surprise and happiness, this is the working team that was formed, like the core one. We had more than 4,000 people signing up, 700 teams. We worked on the technological bit with Krieger, who at the time, Christian Krieger was, I think, all of 23 years old. And he created this amazing thing that could simulate GTFS, that for you the transportation wonks out there probably know that it's kind of like the data standard for mobility. And in 2 weeks, we were able to map the equivalent to a turn and a half around the circumference of the Earth, or more than 420-something mapping days. This is a day that the mayor of Mexico City presented for the first time the map. And this is the map that for the first time actually showed us what was happening on the ground, and the data obviously open because that's what we did. Then a lot of NGOs, WRI, the government itself, the new government, et cetera, were using this data. These are the winners. These are the 100 winners, as you can see, incredibly young. And one of the things that I find incredibly interesting about this hybridity of a team of, again, like, both, yes, the urban experts, but also the narrative experts, is that the reason why we could have 4,000 people signing up to help us do this was because there was a larger story that they wanted to be part of. So, everything that has to do with narrative aesthetics, et cetera, it's not the cherry on the cake. It should be very much a part of the core and the DNA of all of the projects. And, one of the things that I was always very proud of in terms of projects at the lab was that, we were catching up with the rest of the world, because obviously in a place like New York, all of the buses have GPS. But in a way, it was about both catching up with the other cities, but it was also perhaps leapfrogging forward. And so when Beth Novick, who was the former CTO of the United States under Obama, she wrote an article for The Guardian on crowdsourcing expertise and the future of government. She mentioned Mapatón as one of the examples of this future of government. So that's actually the place that I think labs should hold, is to be inventive enough to solve challenges, but then also how do you explore these urban possibilities of the future in one single swoop. And then happily, just a year ago, because again, like even though the lab folded, a lot of projects actually, they had such good momentum that they continue still now, to the benefit of who has them in their hands. Like we just, in a way, started the conversation. But Whereas my transit, who was one of the partners on this, and one of my former team members was actually advising them as well later in a later date, Google Maps just completely switched their data standards for wayfinding in all of the world to be able to accommodate cities such as Mexico City in terms of the data that is used. And not only that, but last week, they actually just announced that they have $14 million in funding for helping cities map their informal bus systems, because this is the majority of the world. Like we think it's the outlier, but it's actually the very epicenter. So what I find fascinating, again, because I'm dedicating this talk to the digital day, is that civic companies can actually really give Silicon Valley a nice run for their money, but actually create the type of societies that we want to step into instead of being at odds with them. And I find that incredibly interesting. So it's not just about data, policy, efficiency. And even though, one of our biggest instruments was using GIS to understand Mexico City at a much more granular fashion, understanding marginalization, what we would call spatial justice, like the uneven distribution of resources across Mexico City. Just as important as that hard data was actually doing, for example, community mapping of seeing where the assets for the community lay. Just as important for us was, with the pretext of the Mexico City Constitution, of being able to, that we crowdsourced, by the way, of being able to create what we called a survey of urban imaginaries, where we queried with the help of a couple of universities. Again, like we really use that citizen muscle to just like an astounding degree. We were able, thanks to people like them, to go into 1,400 neighborhoods of Mexico City and ask 31,000 people about their subjective city. What is it that they love about the city? What is it that they hate and find are the biggest challenges? How did they imagine the future of Mexico City? And there was all sorts of interesting things that now we can actually navigate that data by gender, by neighborhood, by lots of ways. But it was truly interesting to see. This is the type of people we were asking. Also created a social media campaign. In terms of the potential futures of Mexico City, even though we were prompting for positive ideas, we mostly got back Mad Max scenarios of a sinking city and everything is going to end. So every time that we would come up with something that was interesting, because we were a lab, or problematic, and this was both interesting and problematic, because we were a lab, we were able to incorporate it into our agenda. So instead of staying on track and saying, oh, this is what the lab does, We were shape-shifting all the time, and all the time incorporating new questions, gathering new communities. And so I've started a new department even at the lab to think about urban futures. Should government worry that, mostly nobody is imagining a positive future for Mexico City, even though, this city has so many people, including myself, just like stubbornly passionate and completely in love with it? And I'd say yes, we need to start figuring out that the objective city is not only important, but also the subjective city. Because cities are cultural, social, political, and emotional beings. They are not machines. So we really need to be careful with the metaphors and the analogies that have very real repercussions. So in many ways, understanding that emotionalness of Mexico City, one of the other projects that we got into was helping moderate, if you will, or create a citywide conversation around something that was incredibly tension-filled, which was Uber coming into Mexico City. That after France, Mexico City was the second most violent place ever. And we have the largest taxi cab fleet in the world as well. So this is what it looks like. It was incredibly costly politically. And the mayor, I guess because it was so hot, allowed me to create a citywide debate. So we worked with MIT to, first of all, create a platform for crowd law, for being able to draft policy together. But we also did a debate where we brought in people experts from very different fields that had very opinionated. This was not kind of like a political theater. This was truly a big debate. And to attest to that, like before that, I even had like this slightly scary thing where a lot of the headlines of newspapers across Mexico City was like, oh, Gabriella, Gómez-Mont, probably bought by Uber, and Uber's manipulating. After people heard the heated discussions and saw the profiles, there was no mention again. And we were able to change the conversation from Ubers versus taxis to basically talking about the need of public transportation, of not only regulating Uber, but actually thinking about deregulating the cab drivers and making them competitive. So it was truly interesting because, we didn't really have a platform to do this crowd law. This was in the very early days of crowd law. So with MIT, I had a fellowship at that time with them, and Travis Rich from an amazing laboratory, he was kind enough to help us turn a academic platform into a policy platform. So basically, one of the big conclusions of this is we can no longer think of urban, technological, political, social, and cultural innovation as separate things. Like it all has to be part of it. And first, we need to think about the types of societies we want, and then figure out the onset. And just to end, why is this important? One of the examples that I love about the importance of the subjective cities and our metaphors and these more of emotional acupuncture is that about 15 years ago, when some people were trying to implement the bike sharing system in Mexico City, it took about 3 years to change legislation for this to happen. And both within government and without government, they got a lot of kickback saying, this is a death wish. You're going to send people to the grave. We are Mexico City. We're not Copenhagen. After a lot of fights, it suddenly happened. And because we had Ecobici, started off with the bike lanes and this and that, people started thinking like, oh, well, maybe we are a biking megalopolis. And in the last Origin Destin survey in 2017, if I remember correctly, it turns out that we now have 700,000 people every day that are biking in Mexico City, which is the size of Copenhagen. So, percentage-wise, we might not be Copenhagen yet, but, just like in sheer numbers, we're already there. So objective typographies, yes, but also social imaginaries, and also really understand not only the physical infrastructure of a city, but also the symbolic one. So that means translating as well policy into the experience of the city. We created the first roadmap the road safety map for policy for Mexico City. It's the leading cause of death in adolescents and children in Mexico are accidents, and we didn't have a road safety policy, which is kind of crazy. But after we actually passed the law and did the data portal, we then would close down streets. We would do bike rides with film festivals. We would create, just like all of these really interesting things in terms of events, so people would get an experience of the city that we wanted. And so basically, I will end with this. Yes, many times the answer is technological, but it is never, ever the question. So what type of city do we want and how would we get there, I think is one of the more important questions to be had in terms of labs, in terms of cities, and hence just like the sheer importance of political imagination.
Gabriella, thanks so much for this really inspiring talk and the broad range of projects that you showed to us. We're running a bit short on time, but I'd collected at least like 2 questions for you from the audience. But first of all, I'd like to ask you, your lab closed down in 2018. So maybe you can let us know why. Like, for example, sometimes we joke, like, if we are really successful, we will probably disappear and kind of diffuse, you know, into other governmental structures. Is that what happened? So would you say that you had a long-lasting transformation in government, or were there completely other reasons on why you shut the lab down?
So first, I completely agree. I actually think that in a way, redundancy would be at one point in time a measure of success of labs, because we have been able to infuse innovation and a creative mindset and a collaborative spirit so deep into the DNA of the way that governments work that it's almost as if every government unit had its own lab mindset, if you will, and that you know when to use best practices, when to use policy and long-term thinking, and when to use experimentation and prototyping and whatnot. No, so, you know, Mexico City included, but let's say New York, that other people will know. Everything that Janet Sadikan did in terms of mobility, of being able to create these first not permanent spaces that then became permanent, that is a lab way of working in a way. So I completely agree. Second, no, like, you know, Mexico City, to be honest, I don't think it's, as I mentioned, like a delirious beast of a city that I love with my whole heart, but it is a challenging city. So it's not that, okay, like 6 years we solved Mexico City, not at all. I think we fortunately were able to advance many of the conversations that we wanted, as well as something that was incredibly important, readdress and redefine what the issues were. And you know, why we worked on Pedestrian City and not sustainable mobility was, you know, because sustainable mobility has a paradigm, has a boundary. Pedestrian City is, yes, road safety, but it's also public space. And it's also the use of said public space, right? So, you know, how do you actually redefine those issues was something that was important to us, and that continues still. The reason why the lab folded was rather because we had a change in government, and it was, you know, Mexico City has only and never fortunately been ruled by left wing, but there was a big split within the left wing party in the last 6 years. And so my mayor was on one end and the other party was on the other. And they decided that one of the things that they wanted to do was have a clean slate and not have any projects that came from the former mayor. So it was not only us, but a lot of things actually that died in the intent. But I will say this very shortly, that is why I am now so convinced about governance and collaborative practices, because even though the lab no longer exists, it's not only my team that is still working with the new government and actually other cities and governments the world over, some of them within government, like Bernardo that worked with the mayor of Mexico City, and me working on the outside with others. But actually a lot of the ecosystems that we helped articulate, some of them that didn't exist, some of them we opened the door to, are still working. There's new studios, there's new actors. The example that they did, let's say in mobility with Mexico City, the same people we worked with, they're now more. And they actually just changed on a constitutional level, the first time in the world that mobility as a right is up there. And now the road safety issues that we worked on in terms of Mexico City are soon going to become national policy. So working with your constituency, it's a lot more time consuming. Sometimes people would tell me, but wouldn't it be quicker if you just do the Uber thing, for example? But the thing is, you know, we really need to think about civics. I think that the reason why we're voting in these incredibly problematic politicians sometimes is because we cannot be technocratic. We need to be political and civic, and political in terms of what type of societies that we want, right? Not politicized in that sense, hopefully.
Interesting, thank you. So Angela is asking, to what extent do the participants of your events represent the different groups of society? And I was also wondering, you, on the one hand, you kind of build top-notch technology and work with data. On the other hand, you do kind of social work with marginalized communities. Yes. So how do you connect these fields, you know, because using open data is a rather privileged thing. Not many people can do it, for example. But in general, was your approach to be like representative of the whole diversity of the city, and how did you achieve that?
It's a great question, because to be honest, I think it was one of the biggest challenges. We were the first lab in Latin America, the first one in the emerging world, and the first one in megalopolis. And so there were things that my counterpart, such as MindLab in Denmark, didn't really need to think about. Like, societies are a lot more equal. And here, both, again, like using diversity as the resource, amazing resource that it is, but also understanding what a hurdle divisiveness and inequality is, I think, had to be at the very center of the lab. That said, I always also thought it incredibly important never to underestimate Mexico City. Mexico City is one of the most talented, sophisticated, I mean, I'm biased, of course. It's the reason why I got into government, is my big stubborn love for Mexico City. So, take that from where it's coming. But, we needed to use that. So it's not about, but, we have poverty, so we can't do open data. So first of all, let's say even the things that were sophisticated, such as open data, APIs, and whatnot, how do you actually always go for a socially minded thing first? So the reason why we did our GIS, for example, was actually to figure out, as I mentioned, that Mexico City for the first time inaugurate a conversation on spatial justice. So can we do urban planning? I didn't explain one of the other agendas in Mexico City, which was around play, the right to play and the right to the city for kids. But we basically created like a map of where the hotspots were of mapping number of kids block by block, crossing that within this excess of marginalization and segregation, and then crossing that again with a lack of public space. Because Mexico City has in some neighborhoods 42 square meters of public green space, and in others it has less than 4. So, how do you actually have long-term, medium-term, and immediate things to do about the inequality that exists in your city? And this was, we could not have done it without technology. That said, let's say with that, we would actually work, that I didn't explain at all either, but we worked very frequently with communities on the ground. So, when we defined these hotspots, we would actually bring together the neighborhoods. And this was in some of the more marginalized communities in Mexico City. When we worked on participatory budgeting, as I mentioned, we then had a technological component. But since we knew that there was a digital gap in Mexico City, the way that we did it was actually articulating a team of people and having government offices that already exist be able to give people information and to help them use the computers in case they wanted to. So it becomes a resources that is articulated within the government. And last but not least, we also had huge surprises. When we did our first data festival, there's one of the boroughs in Mexico City, which is where a lot of creatives live, came second in place in terms of representation of the borough. But to our huge surprise, in first place, but to our huge surprise, the second place in representation was Iztapalapa, that is historically, it used to be a shanty town. And that was the second place. And again, we had 1,200 people signing up. And the guy that won first place was from Milpa Alta, that is a rural community in Mexico City that is usually, so, we were also ourselves surprised, which is why you must never, ever, I think, take your cities for granted, but rather, try to work on different levels at once.
Gabriella, thanks so much. It was an honor to have you here and to have you opening this day for us. I really hope that we can continue our collaboration during the work on the Smart City strategy, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks again for speaking to us, and thanks for the patience for our next speaker, Sascha Frieseke, who will be up next. Thanks so much, Gabriella.